The backwoods of North Carolina are full of old, sleeping houses that ought to be torn down. They dream only awful things. I grew up in a very, very small farm town with a population below 150 or so people. I won't name drop the town for obvious reasons, and even if I did, you wouldn't find anything to write home about. There's a caution light and several abandoned buildings, a barely functional gas station that will grossly overcharge you, and that's about it. You go more than a half a mile in any direction, and you will officially be outside of city limits. Though there are dozens of people who live in these heavily wooded farmlands that call the town home, simply because it's the closest thing in the shouting distance, though that would be akin to saying that Mars was within shouting distance of Earth. I've had a few experiences in these woods that I can't fully explain. I can describe them, and I will, but I cannot offer any scientific explanation for them. I know that tales of wendigos and skinwalkers and other natural forest demon spooks are popular, but wendigos are a creature that belong to the tribal legends of tribes centered around the Great Lakes region of the northern United States, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and into the eastern coast of Canada. Skinwalkers are exclusively tied to the Navajo religion and Navajo grounds, which are in the deserts of the far west of the U.S. Keep that in the back of your mind. I first began to notice the presence when I was around 12. Playing in the woods was really the only pastime I had available to me, outside of playing video games. But video games got old rather quickly. I was an only child, and there weren't any other children in the area, so exploring the woods was good at first for the outlet of my imagination. Prior to my first experience, the spookiest thing in the woods around here would have been venomous snakes. Even then, snakes we have aren't likely to kill you unless you just seriously neglect the wound or have an allergic reaction. Aside from them, the largest predators we have are coyotes, which are mostly afraid of humans, and the rare cougar that happens to be passing through, which is so infrequent that it isn't worth worrying over. So, the first day in question was a normal summer day. I was out hiking, collecting rocks, building forts out of sticks. You know, the standard things a 12-year-old boy does. It was about sundown, and I wasn't quite ready to head home yet, when I noticed something was off. During the summer in North Carolina, the woods are anything but quiet. You have a cacophony of sounds. Crickets, frogs, birds. There's a whole chorus of wildlife that all wants to be heard. You may even get the occasional coyote pack howling, or a bobcat screaming. The point of this is the woods are far from quiet, and sudden silence in the wood in these times is not an accident. But that's precisely what I noticed. All the noises had stopped. I could hear the wind between the mixture of old growth and pines, and I could hear the distant babbling of a creek. But that was it. This was strange to me, but at the time, I didn't realize what an ill omen was in and of itself. I actually remember thinking that the water sounded peaceful, and walking deeper into the woods to listen to it better. As I did, though, I began to get this overwhelming sense of foreboding. It wasn't the standard, I feel like I'm being watched. No, I didn't feel any eyes on me, or feel like I was being followed, or any of those standard paranoias. This was like, have you ever stayed at a party too? You know, you get there at 9, and now it's 2 a.m., and suddenly, you realize that you don't know anyone who is still there. You also didn't see this new guy come in, but he's glaring at you. And come to think about it, so was that girl in the kitchen. You've overstayed your welcome, and it's probably time to go. That's exactly what I felt like, even if I lacked the metaphor to express it at the time. The air itself felt heavy. Everything in my mind and body was screaming at me that I needed to leave, that this place was not mine anymore. It had been fine in the morning hours, but now, this was the domain of someone or something else, and I wasn't welcome. I remember feeling as if the trees were warning me, leave or else. So I did. Initially, I walked, but by the time the sun had begun its descent and the sky had begun to darken in the twilight, I was jogging. I never broke into a full-on sprint. I don't know why, but I felt showing too much fear was a bad idea. Eventually, I made it back to the road and looked back to the woods. I didn't see anything, but that's when the feeling of being watched set in. I felt that there were eyes just beyond the tree line and out of sight, and that were staring right back at me. I went home and pushed the experience out of my mind as best as I could. From then on, I made it a point to always be out in the woods by dark, or to have a firearm with me if I knew I was staying later. I should note to you that there were several times after that I wound up in the woods at dusk, but did not have this feeling return. There weren't any special circumstances that seemed to summon it. Just sometimes things were fine. Others, I all but sprinted for civilization. I didn't have any more overt experiences, however, until years later. I don't know what the catalyst was, but the activity ramped up dramatically in a year's span. The first was like this, and was in October of 2018. And since then, the woods have gone from a home for the occasional unsettling experience to a place of actual danger and terror. I went camping with some college friends of mine during the October in question. In total, there were just 3 of us, and were mostly roughing it. We had a tent, but we chopped our own firewood, and all of that jazz. We had camped pretty deep in the woods. It was dark by the time we were fully set up, and had finished cooking. We ate, and then we proceeded to get very drunk. I don't know how much we actually drank, as we were just sipping out of a handle of vodka and passing it around the campfire, as we talked about everything from ghost stories to the more tangible fears in our lives, such as dating and the prospect of post-graduation. This went on well into the night, with the stories growing more nonsensical and the laughter growing louder as the bottle grew lighter. By around 1:30 a.m., it had grown deathly cold. I decided that that was night for me, and I was going to get into my sleeping bag. The other 2 weren't ready to sleep yet, and one of my friends, we'll call him Frank, decided he wanted to smoke a cigarette. Meanwhile, the other friend, we'll call him Tim, decided that this was a good time for him to go climb a large rock, about 70 or so yards away from the tent. Frank begrudgingly goes to supervise him while he finishes off his cigarette. So they're both a good 70, maybe 80 yards away from the tent. I'm now in my sleeping bag and trying to fall asleep, and I could hear them laughing and talking, and it's obviously far away. It's right at this time that something heavy slams into the side of the tent. Heavy enough that I'm surprised the tent didn't actually collapse. I didn't move. I was drunk, but not so drunk as to not realize that whatever was out there didn't stop to borrow a cup of sugar. That sense of dread filled me at once, and even though I had my shotgun with me, I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. I felt staying still was a much safer approach. I heard something breathing. It wasn't human breathing, though. This was loud and weirdly wet sounding. It wasn't sniffing or anything like that, just deep breathing. This only went on for a total fewer than 10 seconds, and all at once, it was gone. No footsteps, no banging on the tent, no gradual decline in breathing. Nothing. It was gone, and Frank and Tim had never seen that it was there, let alone what it might have been. It's honestly probably best they didn't. They stayed up a while longer before turning in. I woke up first, stepped out to see if there were any footprints, and there weren't. But there was something much more ominous. The entire clearing we were camping in now had, scattered throughout the grass and early morning frost, circles of bones. Not large bones, but crushed up and arranged bones of small creatures, like a rabbit or a small bird maybe. I would assume we were in a predator's hunting ground, save for the fact that bones were neatly arranged in circles, all of the same sizes and with equal spacing. I woke Tim and Frank up. We packed up and left immediately. This last experience is the most recent and the most intense. There was a meteor shower not too long ago, and I returned to the clearing where my friends and I went camping to observe it, as there is very little light pollution. It was stellar, and I loved every second of it. But I wasn't out there long where my dog, I brought him with me, he's good company, started acting strange. He had pinned his hair back while lying down, and was now staring very intently at the tree line. He wasn't barking or growling. In fact, he was silent and just watching. It was strange, but I assumed he'd caught wind of a deer or other prey animal, and he was on the hunt, though he was far too lazy to actually go and chase it. After a moment, a nearby coyote howled. I felt a wave of relief, as my dog's behavior was beginning to make me uneasy. He was just tense by the coyote, and it would pass. There was something wrong, though. First, coyotes hunt in packs. It's extremely uncommon for a solo coyote to hunt and howl like this. And second, my dog had begun to whimper, now, and was shying back to the edge of the truck, as though he were afraid, and the coyote was drawing closer, it seemed. My brain began connecting a lot of the dots. The woods were silent. The feeling had returned. I was in the same spot as the last encounter, and then I registered the sounds of branches breaking. Coyotes aren't heavy enough to do that, I thought. And the second I did, as though whatever was out there had waited for me to realize it, the coyote stopped pretending to be one. Or at least I don't know. It stopped howling. It then erupted into the most horrible sound I have ever heard. The coyote was laughing. It wasn't a hyena sort of laugh, though. It was this garbled, mangled mess of sound that sounded like an animal trying and doing a piss-poor job to impersonate the cadence of a human laughter. And it was on this recording track, where every fourth laugh, it seemed to loop. It was rapidly growing louder over the sound of breaking branches. I frantically jumped up, grabbed my dog, and fumbled for my truck keys to get out of there. As I tried to get my keys and get my door open, the laughing stopped, only for this guttural and deep scream to resound from the forest. I say deep to emphasize that it wasn't a bobcat or a fox. They have high-pitched sounds. This was very low. It had the same pitch as, say, a roar, but it was that same horribly botched nonsense that the laugh was in. Of course, the laughter resumed immediately, but as I got in my truck and turned the lights on, dead silence. In a moment of stupid bravado and curiosity, I turned my truck towards the tree line before I left to shine my headlights and see if I saw anything. Between the trees, I saw what seemed to be a man. He was of average height and wearing a white t-shirt, and I assume blue jeans, though I could not see a face or arms or anything of that nature. Just his silhouette and his clothes. In hindsight, I think he was only a silhouette, maybe. I blinked and he was gone. That's my story. I don't know what it is in the backwoods of North Carolina. I don't want to know. And it's probably best you don't try to find out. It doesn't seem too welcoming to strangers after all. Anybody that has been on the Navajo Res has either probably heard of or had some creepy things or experienced some pretty creepy things. Namely, Skinwalkers. I have only seen one, and here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo res to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo res, and we usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning. But this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip. So, we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out, and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving, before we had entered into the res. By this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at roughly 85 miles an hour. As this figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white, with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring right at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I couldn't look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The thing just smiled at me, this very inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked, yellow, pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the entire ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumple down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair began appearing all over the skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert, far out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anybody for fear they would think I was crazy. So, I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next day in school in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feather serpent-like thing, turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker, and it might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and res, and if I do have to go south, I go around, way around. This story happened late June, right before the 4th of July. I don't know if I believe that this is what I truly experienced, but my best friend's great-grandmother is certain. For reference, I am a 20-year-old female. My fiancé and I finally had a few days off this summer and decided to take a little trip. We live in northern Utah and decided to head to Wyoming to buy some cool fireworks and camp out. Plus, his grandparents live very close to our desired camping location. My fiancé, whom for the story we'll call Jake, has a hatchback, and we planned on lowering the back seats and just sleeping in the car. After purchasing some fireworks, we head out to our camp location. It was called Blazon, or Blazon. The roads were rough and narrow, and there were about 1,000 wild rabbits running around. Other than that, the road was pretty clear. We parked our car behind a mountainous pile of rocks to block out as much light pollution from the nearest town as possible. I had never seen the stars so bright. It was still pretty light when we got there, and I took in as much of my surroundings as my eyes could handle. We made a fire as it started to darken. We cooked some hot dogs and set off some aerial fireworks before deciding to call it a night. We climbed in the car, and Jake fell asleep pretty quickly. I, however, felt very strange. I opened the back of the car to take in the silence, the pure blackness of the night. I've been camping before, but I had never felt like this. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't comforted. The blackness ahead of me felt almost unreal, like I could reach out and touch rich black velvet. Or perhaps it felt like a projection, like what I was seeing wasn't real. I decided to call it a night and shut the hatch. I didn't sleep very well. We woke up fairly early, at about 6:30 a.m. We had planned to go shooting a bit, since I had never seen so much as held a gun, and go to Opal for arrowhead and rock hunting. I exited the car and walked a few feet away to pee, and literally 10 feet to the left of the car was a sheep's corpse. Like I said, I took a good look around when we first arrived. It wasn't too dark for me to notice the previous day. In fact, our campfire was about 5 feet from it. Out of morbid curiosity, I went to investigate. It was probably the most disturbing and eerie thing I had ever seen. It looked freshly killed, yet the sheep's innards and bones were entirely gone, other than the skull. The eyeballs were still intact, and that's usually the first part of a body to decompose. It was like it was completely hollowed out, but there was no blood anywhere. No dried blood, or any sign that this was an animal's meal. Something else I noticed that was strange was the skin looked almost leathered where it was peeled back. But seeing as it was so fresh, I knew that was impossible. I yelled to Jake, who had been camping in this area very many times in his lifetime, to see if he had any ideas. He was completely baffled. We decided to just sleep in his grandparents' house that night, so we quickly packed up and left. As we were leaving, I saw yet another sheep's corpse, exactly like the other, right on the side of the road that we had traveled on to get there. There was no way we could have missed that. We were paying very close attention to the road because of all the rabbits. Now, I was really uncomfortable. However, the rest of the trip was a lot of fun. In fact, while we were shooting, I found half an antelope's skull that was a bit bleached by the sun. I thought it was pretty cool, so I put on some gloves and bagged it up, with the intent of cleaning and sanitizing it when I got home. Once we got back home, I decided to stop by and see my best friend. We were driving down the road, smoking cigarettes, when my car suddenly broke down. I was feeling pretty unhappy, but while we waited for my father to come help me tow it or push it to the nearby mechanic to leave overnight, I told her about my weird sheep corpses. My best friend is Native American, and immediately got very extremely uncomfortable and told me to talk to her great-grandmother. I agreed, and visited within the next few days after my car had been repaired. However, I fell very ill the day after my car broke down. I had the flu, which was unusual for the time of year. I wanted to keep my visit brief in fear of getting them sick, but I ended up staying there all night. I told her about my experience with the sheep, the weird feeling I had the first night, and the antelope skull. She was positive I came across something called a skinwalker, a person, a witch with the supernatural ability to turn into any animal he or she desires, to be able to transform. Legends sometimes require that the skinwalker wears a pelt of the animal. They are believed to be very evil, and Native Americans refused to talk about them at night, which explained why my best friend was so uncomfortable. Her great-grandmother also mentioned that running into a skinwalker can cause disease and bad luck, like my car breaking down and contracting the flu. After her telling me all of this, I was really scared and overwhelmed. She asked me if I took any strange souvenirs, and I told her about the antelope skull. She told me to go home, bury it in a field, and I should be fine after that. Well, I did just that. As soon as I came home, I grabbed a shovel and the skull, went to an old field and buried it. I burned some sage after I buried it at the site, in my car and in my room. However, she said that may not take care of my bad luck. And she's right. My car continues to mysteriously break down, again and again, immediately following repairs. I don't really know what to believe. Bad luck happens, and my car is a bit old, and it's bound to have problems, and I frequently still get sick. But I still can't explain what I saw, and why I felt what it felt. Does anyone have any suggestions or ideas? If this really is the work of a skinwalker, I need to know what to do, just to get my life back on track. I'm a poor college student, and I can't afford fixing my car. I just replaced the power steering rack, and that set me back $600. Immediately after getting that repaired, my brake light and training light came on. I checked my transmission fluid, and there's definitely a leak or something going on. Any advice or speculation is always appreciated. Although it's already been almost 14 years to the day, I encountered something horrendous when I was out down in the Sonoran Desert years and years ago with a couple of close friends of mine exploring. Before you write me off as a phony for exploring the soaring heat of the desert, since it usually can get up to 120 degrees, my friends and I felt pretty acclimated and would go and explore in short bursts when we could. We've always been fascinated by the desert climate, the environment, the plants, and just the plains itself. Just being out in that environment, it brings something out of you, something that yearns to learn more about the earth itself. I only have a little bit of native in me, and I'm not exactly sure what tribe, but I have a very few close circle of friends that are full native, and it's always been our thing to go and explore the areas we can that are close by, even if it is for only short little bursts of time due to the extreme heat and dryness. Before I continue my story, I want you to know that before I did this, I was well aware of the things that live out in the desert, supposedly, like skinwalkers and other supernatural entities that are said to do harm to you. Well, during the daytime, I figured we'd be fine and didn't pose any threat or any alertness to any supernatural entities looking to do harm. That's where I had it wrong, and although I don't consider what we ran into a supernatural entity, it is something of evil, or so I believe, and my friends believe. It is not a natural creature, and had something very different about it, a different kind of energy that I can't really describe. While the Sonoran Desert is beautiful and desolate at the same time, it holds a lot of beautiful plant life and very dangerous animal life, like rattlesnakes for one, and other dangerous animals. But what we encountered this day was something I had never heard of before, although some of my native friends believe they have heard of it, and that their elders have spoken of it and even warned about it. Now that I know these creatures exist, I'll be much more careful in my explorations of the desert and the areas that I dwell around. In fact, because of this, I'm not sure I even have much of an appetite for more adventuring in the desert. What I encountered that day is what I can only describe as large desert serpent beings that are more than triple the length of us. I'm talking easily 20 feet, if not longer in length, and large enough to swallow a man whole. These were gargantuan serpents, pale white and streaks of yellow and gold, whatever these beings or serpents were. They came off as something unnatural. They carried a different energy around them, not like a typical animal you'd run into. So I don't want you to listen to this and think it's just some sort of snake we ran into. This had a totally different feel to it. And like I said, it had an energy to it, just like a foreboding energy, an omen, like you were not supposed to be around it, or that we had gone too far in an area we were not allowed to go into, which makes the entire event very interesting. At the time, nearly 14 years ago, my friends and I were not only exploring, but we had a destination in mind for our mission. One of my friends was told about a small little supposed burial ground not too far away. It sounded like it was unmarked, but it had a magic barrier around, or so we were told, and warned profusely not to go around there. My friends and I, although not being native myself, but they are, none of us really believed in that hocus pocus, or if we did, it was at a very ritualistic level, very minimal, and we never would have thought that something like this would have happened. I know, me saying this probably sounds incredibly far-fetched and out of reality, but I'm telling you, I have no desire to make something like this up. There's nothing that I can gain from it personally. My best assumption is that whatever these things were had to do in part with this burial ground that we were close to. Perhaps these things were summoned or called to be guardians of this place. I don't really know. We never really got answers, because after encountering these things, we were too scared to tell the people that told us not to go around there, so we kinda just kept it between ourselves. And even now, 14 years later, we've still kept it a secret, due to shame and punishment from our elders and our family. I can remember that it was a very hot day that day, just like every day in the desert, so there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But I can say the direction we were going, at the time, we weren't even sure if it was the correct way to go. We were kind of just guessing, based on the loose directions we had and where it was at, judging by the general area. And finally, after getting over a small hill, and almost coming into a dip in the valley, and the best way I can describe it, I'm not great at describing land, so forgive me, but we got to this dip in a very small valley, where we could almost feel the energy around us shift, and I'm not the only one that noticed it. My two friends, who I won't give names to the story, have also noticed a change. We all looked at each other at once, and told each other we can feel something different in the air. I can't even begin to describe the feeling, but it was almost like a change in the air, like an electromagnetic feeling, but that's really hard to pinpoint. The only way you could ever know is if you experienced it yourself. It wasn't long after, before we felt shakes in the ground. I'm not talking about an earthquake. I'm talking about like something big moving underneath the ground. And that's when multiple of these things appeared. We felt the light rumbles underneath our feet, coming in our direction, when these large serpents, two of them, burst through the sand. Massive snakes. I have never in my life seen anything so big. The only thing I can draw somewhat of a comparison to is a game called Resident Evil 1, and somewhere in that game, the main character fights this really large snake. And if you go ahead and go on Google and look it up, you could probably find it. It's been forever since I played that game, but going by my memory, the snake, or boss, whatever it was, I believed was named Yawn, Y-A-W-N, just like a yawn you do when you wake up. Now, if you see a picture of this, obviously it's a fictitious game character, but that size should give you somewhat of a good idea. The snake in the game is obviously so large that it's fictional, and the snakes we saw weren't as big. They were smaller, significantly, but not overly small to where it didn't match up. I'm trying to give you this game character because it's the only thing I could really think matches up with the size of that description, at least close. So now that you have that in your head, think that, but a pale white color, with a yellow marking down its sides and back, and a head almost resembling that of a viper, with red-yellow glinting eyes. It looked mean, and while these snakes didn't necessarily come at us to try and devour us, I got the feeling that they easily could have, had they really wanted to. They slithered around us, encircling us, as if to give us a warning. It was almost like I got the feeling and vibe to go and to not continue further. They continued to encircle us, almost like they were sizing us up, watching us before they made their move. At some point or another, all three of us began to bolt out of there and back the way we came, with these incredibly large serpents still slithering around, looking at us, sizing us up, determining what their next move was to make. We didn't give it a chance. I don't know if their plan was to attack us, and they never tried. They never moved in close, or acted hostile in any way, although I do believe their entire output of emotion and energy was stay where you are, or leave now. Had I felt like we tried to press on, even with their presence, they would have struck us, and that would have been the death of either of us, I just feel. A snake of that size, that could have been the end of us. I can't even begin to tell you their venom output. That's pretty much all there is to my story, and I understand that I'm not a great storyteller by any means, and I'm not an author or a writer, so this is just what you get. But I'm sure you get a lot of crazy stories, true and untrue, and I'm not here to spread false information. I'm here to tell you that there's things in the desert that we can't always be aware of or know they exist. And usually, if there's a place you're not allowed to go or forbidden to go into because of rumors or tradition, well, there's probably a reason for it, and I believe there's more there than just old wives' tales or superstitious junk. My friends and I certainly didn't tell anybody in our communities about this. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not native, so I didn't really have anybody to tell my story to, nor would they have believed me if I did. And my two friends, well, like I said, to this day, they've kept it a secret, because had they told their families or communities, they would have been punished, scolded, and severely reprimanded. I mean, after all, we were just dumb 16-year-old kids looking for an adventure, for a thrill. I can't tell you my name or where I actually work, but for the sake of what I have to relate to you, I will say that my name is Jim, and I will tell you that I work at a national park where the stone is a particularly sunny color. I know you usually deal in cryptid stories, but I've come across some things that are just as odd. There's a few kiddie playgrounds scattered throughout the whole park, and often enough, it's my job to patrol these in a regular circuit, just to make sure that bears and other predators are keeping their distance from children. The way I usually carry this out, I park my squad car and sit and watch for a few moments. Then I get out and take a stroll. If all's well, I roll onto the next playground. In the middle of one exceptionally boring day on a kiddie patrol, I was strolling during a busy hour where kids were out of the school, and parents were letting them all run wild, probably hoping they wouldn't take any of that energy home. I watched a little boy that reminded me very much of my own. A little girl with very white, rather pale skin and straight black hair ran over to him and asked him if he wanted to come meet her grandparents. They were sitting over on a park bench with their backs to us. I smiled at how easily children could make friends. Towards the end of the day, there was an announcement of an Amber Alert. A small boy had gone missing, and when a picture of the boy was officially released, my heart sank. It was the exact little boy I had seen on the playground with a pale little girl. There were gears turning in the back of my head all night, and I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. The next day, I was on patrol again, with orders to keep my eyes peeled for that little boy, just in case he turned back up. I kept my eyes peeled for him all day. He'd been hard to miss. He looked just like my kid. I saw the same little girl from day before, with the pale skin and darker hair. She came up to another little girl and asked her if she'd like to meet her grandparents. That's when those gears in my head began working again. There were again 2 older folks sitting with their back to all the kids sitting on the park bench, further up the park trail. My eyes shifted over to the dark-haired girl and her new friend, who was agreeing to meet her grandma and grandpa. I made my move. I asked her if I can meet her grandma and grandpa too. She wasn't too happy to see me. She looked like I was ruining some of her fun. She took the other girl's hand and led her up the trail, keeping me in sight with a sidelong look. I followed from a distance. The 2 girls stood in front of the couple. The dark-haired girl was definitely not happy to see me. The other girl looked confused, even a little frightened. The dark-haired girl motioned for the other girl to go, and they both ran back to the playground. I strolled up to the older folks, who didn't seem to notice me. I called that a greeting, so as to not startle them. I thought they might be hard of hearing because they didn't stir a bit. When I came around to stand in front of them, I could see the 2 of them were withered up, dead bodies, dry as dead leaves. Another Amber Alert went out that night. That time for the other little girl, the dark-haired one that led away from me. I don't know if anybody's going to believe this story or not, but there's only one way to find out. When you see the small town that I live in, you wonder why they even bother setting aside funds for patrols of the parks. I guess you just never know when trouble is going to come from the outside world into our little sacred quiet place. But something that happened recently has made me question whether trouble always comes from the outside. Our parks are small, but they are just big enough to have a couple of walking trails. If a day is feeling especially slow, I'll take the time to walk these trails for the hell of it. On paper, that means that I'm making absolutely sure that there's no trouble whatsoever. So, one day, I'm walking the trail, and I get a real strong whiff of something good and dead. Not unlike the smell that might come from under your front porch when a squirrel or something else has crawled away to die, maybe poisoned. But this was really strong. Strong enough to make me question the size of the carcass. Once I could tell which direction the wind was coming from, I started to follow the smell. It led me off the trail and into a thick of trees. The more crowded the trees, the worse the smell got. This brought me into a very, very small clearing that I actually didn't know existed. Here, I discovered scraps of sheet metal cobbled together into something like a shrine, complete with a peaked, corrugated roof. Small scraps were arranged into an altar. Behind it was a corpse that was set upright by a virtue of railroad spikes, driven through the chest and shoulders, pinning it to a large wooden crate. The legs were posed cross-legged, and the head had been removed and replaced with the skull of a buck with large antlers. Pink still stained the skull, telling me that both the head and the corpse were about as fresh. Loud flies filled the air. I don't know what to phone any of this as if it couldn't get any stranger. I saw something under the skull, lodged in the neck. Papers. They were papers rolled up and weighed down by the skull. I phoned the whole thing in and waited for dispatch. Nobody ever came. I raced a haul over it, but everyone I mentioned it to just looked at me like they didn't know what I was talking about, or they just didn't care. I called the paper to tell them about what I had found, but as soon as I told them which park, they just hung up on me. Nobody around here is listening, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't think there's anything I can do. This experience, or encounter, whatever you want to call it, has cost me my job. For various reasons, I started to keep a bottle of whiskey on me when I was riding around the park in the patrol car. Things were not good at home, and they weren't good on the job either, so I turned to what I knew: alcoholism. It's gotten me through some pretty rough times in my past, so it's my crutch. I stopped the car when I rolled past somebody that was sleeping on a park bench. Looked to be a male, wrapped in a coat from what I could tell. When I came up to him, the smell was overwhelming. I tried to rouse him and tell him no sleeping, especially on the benches, but he turned his head to look at me with the cloudiest eyes I've ever seen. He swiftly took the bottle of whiskey from my hand, chugged it, tossed it, and ran. I tackled him, and I heard a horrible snapping sound. He wouldn't talk or open his eyes or anything, so I had to call this one out and tell him myself, 'cause I was pretty sure I accidentally broke his neck. The disturbing part is that even though I got busted for the alcohol and got punished, the coroner had told me that he had been dead for well over 2 days. There's no way to explain the supernatural account of this. I'm the only on-duty park ranger for a nature preserve that's smaller than most city parks. I wear my title proudly, and I have wondered often, though, why they never hired more than one person. I'm the only person. The preserve is mostly prairie land with clumps of forest here and there. Between trees are oceans of tall grass. Weather permitting, I do most of my work from an abandoned lookout tower. Well, only abandoned because I'm really the only one there. One evening, as the last of the sun was sinking below the horizon, I was up in that tower, and I saw some sort of light in the grass down below. I wanted to write them off as fireflies, but the lights were too intense, and they weren't the right color. They were lit up too long to be fireflies, and they shimmered like fire, but they didn't stay lit up long enough for me to tell what they were. So, I took out a flashlight and descended the ladder to investigate. As soon as I cast the beam of my flashlight into a cluster of lights, I got the fright of my life when a sudden explosion of all sorts of crazy bestial sounds, snarls, barks, roars, all layered onto each other like there was a team of bears and dogs and wolves on leashes. The grass where I shone my light was boiling with movement, and strange lights swarmed there. I turned my light off. This didn't make anything happen for a few moments. Then the sound stopped, and several lights scattered in all directions, like a bad firework. It took me a while to come down from that tower that night. I still have no explanation for what any of those sounds could have been from. Long ago, a kid had gone missing from one of the parks that I worked at. I mean, you couldn't miss this kid. He looked like his parents had fed him 4 square meals of butter every day. I combed that park for days and found no one. But I did notice that in the distance, I kept spotting a set of antlers that seemed rather long, unnaturally long. I wondered how no hunter had gotten about to bagging a buck with a rack like that. One day, my curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to get a closer look at the animal. Naturally, it kept its distance, but I followed. Tracking it caused me to stumble upon a crude scarecrow in the middle of a glade of prairie grass. The sight of it unsettled me for reasons I couldn't place. But then the scarecrow made a few whimpering sounds. I cut the ropes and unwound the ragged cloth, and there was the missing kid. He didn't look right. He looked much worse than someone had been tied to a pole and stood out in a field. Tears flowed from his purple and red eyes as he couldn't stop talking about how hungry he was. So hungry. And the talking deer sometimes brought him other kids to eat, but it was never enough. He was still so hungry. A shriek from behind me made my ears ring. I turned to see the antlers coming up on me quickly. I could see then the patches of tan leather stretched among the curves and points of the horns. They displayed symbols that looked like they had been Native American, but they couldn't be. They were too infernal. They radiated an unsettling energy, like they were mirrors reflecting death from an evil sun. That child begged for help, but the thing with the antlers was upon him in a burst of speed, faster than lightning, and both of them were a blurred shadow that sailed over the hills and out of my sight. As if to confirm what the kid had told me, other reports of vanishing children that had been last seen in the park began to roll in. You are the first person I've shared this story with. I'm afraid that if I've told my superiors, they would begin to question if I had something to do with this missing child. I know it sounds made up, I get that, but I guess sometimes in life, truth is stranger than fiction.